Lennox gæstede Danmark for at tale om tro og videnskab. John Lennox er professor på University of Oxford og har doktorgrader i matematik og filosofi samt en mastergrad i bioetik. I vores nuværende kultur bliver der ofte argumenteret for, at det er umuligt at være intellektuel og samtidig have en tro på Gud. Derfor har John Lennox mødt mange mennesker, som end ikke tør undersøge den kristne tro, i frygt for at blive betragtet som useriøse. Men har videnskaben udryddet Gud?
To every speaker there belongs a biography. And one of the reasons why I am so involved in the public defense of the Christian faith, is because of my background in Northern Ireland. I come from a country that is reputed for sectarian violence, but I had very unusual parents. First of all, they were Christian without being sectarian. And secondly, they gave me space to think. I therefore owe them an unrepayable debt. Because when I came to Cambridge in 1962, I didn't feel that I was loaded down with a lot of sectarian baggage. I'd been free to think and to read widely, even before I came to university to study mathematics. But in my first week as a student, there was another student at dinner, and he asked me rather too loudly for my liking. He said, "Do you believe in God? Do you go to church?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry, I forgot you're Irish. All you Irish go to church and believe in God, and you fight about it." Now, of course, I'd heard that many times before, but somehow it seemed to me it was very important to do something that was a little bit difficult in Ireland, and that was to meet genuine atheists and genuine agnostics. And so, those many years ago, I started to befriend the first of many hundreds, possibly thousands of people who did not share my worldview, and started to talk to them and began by asking questions to find out why it was they did not believe in God. Why had they chosen the worldview of atheism or just agnosticism? And as I began to question, I discovered that my own Christian faith was developing very rapidly, because I discovered in Christianity there were deep answers to the big questions that I met in my fellow students. And that's where it started, and that's where it has continued to go. I had the opportunity of doing research after I'd finished my PhD at Cambridge, of doing research in 2 German universities, and through that I learned the language, and that opened up the way for me to go during the Cold War period to Eastern Europe, where I was able to see firsthand the effect of atheism taught in the school system, particularly in the German Democratic Republic. And that interest in the observation and talking to people who'd been exposed for many years to atheism in their schools led to me going eventually to Russia after 1989. I'd been a Russian translator for many years of mathematical books and periodicals, but I had to learn Russian very fast when I discovered myself in Siberia and nobody else spoke any other language that I could speak apart from Russian. And it was fascinating during the last years since 1989, being able to discuss these things at high level in the Academy of Sciences, in the former Soviet Union, and in many of the satellite countries and in the universities. And all of it has served to confirm my faith in God and to reinforce the conclusion that science, far from having buried God or executed him, as the Danish title suggests, that science confirms my faith in God. And of course, in recent years, as many of you know, I have been involved in taking on some of the world's leading atheists, like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, Michael Shermer, Victor Stenger, and a whole list of people like this. And I've just returned from America, where I've been in the major Ivy League universities. And if some of you are interested in seeing what it's like in a high-powered context like that, debating some of these people, you will find many of my lectures at veritas.org, veritas.org on the web. But you know, coming straight to the heart of one or two of the big issues tonight, it seems to me that the idea that's spread abroad frequently, that science on the one hand and religion on the other are in essential conflict, is easily seen to be false. Let me give you an example. The Human Genome Project is arguably one of the most famous and exciting projects of our age. Its first director was Jim Watson, who won the Nobel Prize with Francis Crick for discovering the structure of DNA. He is an outspoken atheist. In fact, he claims that his atheism was the motivation for him searching for the origin of life and its nature. The second director of that project was Francis Collins, who's a Christian. Now, the interesting thing about that is a very simple observation. The thing that divides those two men is not their science. They are highly competent, world-class scientists. The thing that divides them is their worldview. And if I can get anything across tonight, I'd like to get this across. That the conflict in our contemporary society is not science versus theology or belief in God. It is a conflict of worldviews that is centuries, millennia old. Let me just go back as far as the ancient Greeks. If you ask an ancient Greek about the universe and said, what is ultimate reality? Well, one group would tell you ultimate reality is matter and the void. Democritus and Leucippus, the fathers of the atomic theory, were brilliant men. And they reduced the universe to two ingredients, atoms and empty space. And because they believed that that is all that existed, their explanation was based on that and was reductionistic. That is, everything in the end can be reduced to the motion of atoms through empty space. We call that the materialist worldview. Richard Dawkins believes it. And of course, if you believe that worldview, it means that you think that everything can be explained bottom up without anything left over. That is, mind reduces itself to brain. Brain reduces itself to psychology, reduces itself to biology, reduces itself to physiology, biochemistry, chemistry, physics, and back to atoms and the void. If you're a materialist, you've got to think that way because there is no alternative. But also in ancient Greeks, there were people like Plato and Socrates who believed that matter and energy were not all that existed. There was transcendence. There were the gods, or there was God. And so coming up through history to us today are these two worldviews, which could be roughly called materialism on the one hand, or naturalism, and theism on the other hand, belief in God. That's where the conflict lies. And you will find scientists on each side. You'll find Nobel Prize winners on each side. And so that conflict comes in. So the real question to ask is not, is science at war with belief in God? It's this. We have these two big worldviews. Imagine them like circles. There are others, but I'm not going to talk about them tonight. Materialism on the left and theism on the right, and science, a little circle sitting in the middle. And the real question is, which way does science point? Richard Dawkins claims that science points to atheism. I claim the exact opposite, that science points to God. Now, one of my reasons for doing that is history. Because I'm sure we're all aware that science, modern science, exploded in the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe. And historians and philosophers have asked the question, why did it explode then? and there. And the generally agreed answer that you might need to nuance a little bit was well summed up by C.S. Lewis, whom I remember incidentally lecturing at Cambridge because I'm that old. Was well summed up by C.S. Lewis, who said this: men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. So, number one reason why I'm not ashamed to be a scientist and a Christian is this: that Christianity gave me my subject historically. Now, isn't that fascinating? That far from belief in God hindering science, it was the very motor that drove it. So how is it that we've got into the situation where the world's most famous living scientist, Stephen Hawking, the physicist from Cambridge, why does he, in common with so many other people, say you have to choose between science and God? And I meet this everywhere I go. It's either science or God. And I've thought about it a great deal, and I've come to the conclusion that there are two main reasons for this confusion. The first is a confusion about the nature of God, and the second is a confusion about the nature of science. So let's look at the first one. You see, when people use the word God these days, you need to be very careful to inquire what they mean. Many people meet me, and when they hear I'm a scientist and believe in God, they say to me, of course, your God is a God of the gaps. That is, you can't explain it, therefore God did it. The old idea, I remember in Siberia once being faced by an intellectual from South America somewhere, and he said, you know, the ancient people used to believe that lightning and thunder was the voice of the gods. Then we did a little bit of atmospheric physics and studied electricity, and we discovered it wasn't the voice of the gods at all. God goes out as science increases. And that's the idea of the God of the gaps, that God is simply a figment of our imagination who explains the things that science hasn't yet explained, but science will one day explain them, and we won't need God anymore. I have never met a serious Christian who believes in a God like that. God is not the God of the gaps, disappearing when we discover how electricity works or lightning works. God is the God who created the whole show. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The bits of it we do understand and the bits we don't. And not only did he create it, God, through his infinite power of his word, upholds it and is carrying it to its ultimate destiny. Christians, other faiths must speak for themselves, do not believe in a God of the gaps. But it's interesting, you know, that a lot of the pioneers of modern science didn't do so either. Let me illustrate this because it's so important to catch this point. I'm going to come at it several different ways. Newton, when he discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, marvelous, I've now got a law that explains how it works, therefore I don't need God. What did he do? He wrote the most famous book in the history of science. It's called Principia Mathematica. And he hoped, and he expressed this hope at the beginning of the book, that through it the thinking person might come to believe in God. In other words, the more he understood of how it worked, the more he admired the genius of the God that did it that way. Now, anybody can understand this. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of Sir Frank Whittle, who invented the turbojet engine. The more you understand of painting, not the less, the more you can understand how difficult it is to paint Rembrandt's Night Watchman. It's the more you know, the more you admire the genius that lies behind it. And it's exactly the same here. The more I understand of the universe, the more I am absolutely enthralled by the sheer genius of the mind of God who did it that way. So that's a very important thing to grasp. But there's another thing that's related to it, and it is simply this. You see, the reason these people could admire God the more they understood about science was that they were not confused about the nature of scientific explanation. Now, we commonly hear that science explains, but do you know what science explains? Newton is a law of gravity. Do you think that tells you what gravity is? It doesn't, you know. Even Newton realized that. The law of gravity doesn't explain gravity at all. No one knows what gravity is. Wittgenstein, the philosopher, made the point very clearly. He said the great deception of the modern age is that we think that the laws of nature are explanations of the phenomena of nature, and they are not. They're simply descriptions. The law of gravity will describe to you what happens if I drop a ball. It'll fall towards the center of the earth. And it'll give me a way of calculating its acceleration and so on and so forth. It doesn't tell me what gravity is. And secondly, as Newton very clearly saw, an explanation in terms of law and mechanism is very different from an explanation in terms of agency. Now let me explain what I mean by that. If we had a Ford motor car in front of us here this evening, and I said, let's look at its engine in particular. I want to offer you two explanations of this engine. One is in terms of the law of internal combustion and engineering. That's the one explanation. The other explanation is Henry Ford. Now you choose between them. Well, I can hear some people tittering and laughing. And I find when I talk to 10-year-olds, they understand it immediately. Because they realize that a full explanation involves both. And secondly, they very readily see that those explanations are not in competition with each other. Henry Ford is an explanation in terms of the agent who designed the original Ford motor car. He is not in competition with the scientific explanation in terms of law, of internal combustion, and of engineering. It's very easy to see, but I'm amazed how some of our world's leading scientists can't see it. And therefore they say you've got to choose between God and science. It's exactly the same as choosing between Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion. It's as foolish as that. And so that's the first thing for us to grasp, that we're not talking about explanations that exclude each other any more than my explanation of the Ford motor car in terms of an agent or of a law. Those things exclude each other. But you know, there's such confusion these days about the nature of law that some scientists, including Stephen Hawking, effectively think that law created the universe. Now, I know it's late at night, but you're a brilliant lot. So it's not too late for a bit of logic. Here's the central argument of the book, The Grand Design, a best-selling book by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow. Here it is. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And I read that, and I thought, half a minute, let me read that again. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. Well, that's a flat contradiction. Number one. But then I thought it's even more interesting than that. The universe will create itself. Now, if I say to you that X creates Y, what do you think that means? Well, it means that you presuppose X to explain the existence of Y, yes? So if I say X creates X, you presuppose the existence of X to explain the existence of X. What does that prove? Ladies and gentlemen, it proves that nonsense remains nonsense even if brilliant scientists write it. That's contradiction number 2, but it's worse than that. Because there is a law of gravity and no gravity? Well, all he says there is a law of gravity, but what would a law mean without gravity itself? Peter Atkins is a professor of physical chemistry at Oxford and author of most of the textbooks around the world as far as I can see. And I once asked him, I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? He said, mathematics. So I started to laugh, and he said, what are you laughing at? Well, I said, that's about the most absurd thing I've ever heard in my life. He said, why? Well, I said, I am a mathematician. Let me put it to you this way, Peter. I said, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Did that ever put 4 pounds in your pocket? I'm glad you're laughing, because one thing the financial crisis has taught us, that doing arithmetic doesn't create money. And yet that's exactly what some of these people believe. Paul Davies talks about clever laws creating the universe. But laws not only can't create, they can't even cause. Let's go back to Newton. Newton's laws of motion will describe for the first few bounces the way a billiard ball moves across the table. But Newton's laws never caused a billiard ball to move in the entire history of the universe, did they? People with a cue caused the ball to move. The laws describe the motion. So at the heart of all of this, there lie the most amazing confusions of thought. And they serve to mix people up inside when they try to respond to this kind of thing. But there's more to this. There's next the question, I've said that one of the first problems is a false understanding of God, a false understanding of law, a false understanding of explanation. But now I come to something immensely important, a false understanding of faith. I debated Peter Singer not long ago in Melbourne. Peter Singer is the world's most famous ethicist, professor of bioethics at Princeton. And it was very interesting because I said to the audience at the beginning, they asked us for a little bit of bio, so I was totally open, and I told them what I told you earlier, that my parents were Christian and so on. So Peter comes on and he says, you know, that's really my problem, you see, with people who believe in God. People tend to remain in the faith in which they've been brought up. So I waited my turn, and after Peter handed it over to me, I said, Peter, I think the audience would be very interested to know about your biography. Tell me, I said, were your parents atheists? He said, yes, they were. Oh, I said, So you remained in the faith that you were brought up in? Oh, but he said, it isn't a faith. Oh, I said, Peter, I'm sorry, I thought you believed it. Now, that reveals immense confusion. Now, this wasn't Richard Dawkins speaking. I could understand it coming from him because he doesn't know any philosophy. But this was Peter Singer speaking, who is a philosopher. And he doesn't realize that his atheism is a belief system. What I believe is a belief system. What he doesn't believe, what he believes is not a belief system. Why does he take that view? Well, for several reasons. You see, when people meet me, particularly if they're called Richard Dawkins, they call me a man of faith. That's an insult. Because what he means by that is, Lennox believes where there's no evidence. Because one of the cleverest moves that have been made by the so-called new atheists has been to redefine the concept of faith. So what is faith? It is A, a religious concept, and B, it means believing where there's no evidence. Dangerously wrong on both counts. Believing where there's no evidence is blind faith, and that's very dangerous. It's the kind of thing that causes young men to guide jet airliners into tall buildings. Blind faith is very dangerous. But the new atheists seem to think that the word faith simply means blind faith. So when they meet someone like me who's a Christian, there's no point in talking to me because by definition I believe where there is no evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make this very clear. Christianity is not based on blind faith. If that were true, get rid of your Bible because it claims to be evidence. Let's look at